It's weighing in, NJ.com's high school wrestling podcast. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Weighing In, NJ.com's high school wrestling podcast, season 2, episode 2. I'm your host, Bob Batters, joined by NJ.com's wrestling reporters, Joe Zedalis, Bill Evans, Ryan Patti, and Jake Aferiat. Hope everyone's having a great holiday season. Busy time of year in the wrestling world in New Jersey. Holiday tournaments galore, a lot going on, and we're here to recap it all. So, guys, welcome back. Hoping everyone is having a great break, and I know everyone has seen some really good wrestling, over these first couple weeks of the season, certainly this last week. A lot of big, high-caliber tournaments, in-state, out-of-state, and, again, a lot to touch on here. So we'll start down in Delaware, one of the biggest tournaments of the season, always a tournament that's had a lot of New Jersey flavor. That's the Beast of the East. We had one champion from one of the North Jersey Powers and some other guys impressed. So I'll kick it over to you, Ryan. A big effort from one of Don Bosco Prep's standouts.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we could talk so much about the job Blair did, but I think what impressed me most about New Jersey showing at the Beast was Santino Rodriguez, the Don Bosco Prep 175-pounder. He won his first Beast title. He beat Jackson Angelo, from Lake Highland Prep, one of the better wrestlers in the country at that weight. And I spoke about Santino briefly on the last episode when talking about Don Bosco. He's part of that 3-man core. It's him, Dante DeLuca, and Nevin Matisich. But, this is who Santino Rodriguez has always been, right? He's kind of been unhealthy. His first 3 years, he actually got injured all 3 times at the Beast. It happened each time, hurt his shoulder. And now we're finally seeing him healthy. He's grown into his long frame. And that's what, his new head coach, Alex Almeida, said is so awesome about him, is that he, grew into that frame. His parents let him grow. He's not cutting weight. At 120 as a freshman, he wasn't cutting a lot of weight. And then he went to 44 as a sophomore, then 65, and now 75. And his walking weight's 185. But with Matisich and DeLuca up there, he wasn't going to go higher than 75. So that's going to be his weight. But remember last year, he wrestled Alessio Parrington closer than anyone else did. And he's become a lot more comfortable wrestling the tight matches with high-profile kids. There was moments where I thought he was going to get taken down, and, he held his kid off. The Angelo kid from Lake Highland Prep wrestled a close decision earlier on in the tournament. And he's really just shown that you could throw the kitchen sink at him and he's going to have a response to it. And he also won at the Sam Cali last weekend for the second time. We'll be talking about that tournament more shortly. But Bill, we also got to see 7 runner-ups from New Jersey at the Beast. You had the other champion, Vinny Anello from Blair, but Michael Batista from Blair was a runner-up. Anthony DeAndrea, Joey Monticello had a great tournament. Josh Paparo was another kid back on the mat. He's at St. Peter's. He's healthy now. He had a shoulder injury last year. Rocco Salerno made a great run of the final. Salasarni from Blair showed how good he is at 190. And then Matteo Vinciguerra at heavyweight. He had a phenomenal run as well. But 35 medalists in total for New Jersey. And I teased it on the first episode. Maybe not a lot of champs, but a lot of kids to the podium. And that's kind of what we saw. Bill, what'd you see from the action in Delaware?
Yeah, you mentioned Vinciguerra. He's kind of quietly become one of the best wrestlers in South Jersey. I mean, you could argue that he is the best. Now, obviously, Sammy Spalding is a defending state champion. Cage Jones, both of those guys from Camden Catholic, was a state finalist a few years ago. Vinciguerra was third last year, beat Benji Shu of Bergen Catholic in the third place match. But Vinciguerra is nationally ranked. He came into that tournament around 17. Ended up beating Isaiah Taylor, who's a Pennsylvania wrestler, in the semifinals, 18-5. Pretty dominating. Ended up losing the final to Lucas Zalata, who's a Rutgers commit from Malvern Prep, 1-0. So the kid that he beat in the semis was ranked 11th. So I expect Vinciguerra to be moving up. More than likely, he's going to be the highest ranked, nationally ranked wrestler from South Jersey. He's got a chance to become the first Woodstown wrestler to make a state final and possibly win it. It looks like him and Christian Alvarez are probably, from St. Joe's Montvale, are probably the top 2 guys. They finished second and third last year with Rocco Delgado moving on, last year's state champ. And also, you mentioned some other guys on the podium. Tyler Palumbo from Christian Brothers also recently committed to Rutgers. Had a really good tournament. He was 6th in the state last year. Ended up 3rd, made the semifinals, lost to the number 1 seed. He had a really good match with Anthony Jackson from Paul VI, who had pinned him last year in the 5th place match. Jackson was up 4-0 with a minute to go, and Palumbo came back and got 2 takedowns, the last one on the line with about 9 seconds left to win that match 6-5, where if that had gone the other way, maybe Jackson's the guy finishing 3rd. Jackson ended up not placing. He lost in the blood round. But certainly those guys could be on a collision course down the road in Atlantic City, as a couple of the top guys at that weight class. But, those are a couple guys that really caught my eye.
Yeah, always a great tournament down there at the Bob Carpenter Center. And like you said, Santino Rodriguez, when you can win a Beast of the East title, generally it's going to set you up for big time success, the rest of the way. And we'll see if that's the case with him. Another huge tournament, this one in state that you guys were at, Ryan and Jake, the Sam Cali Invitational. I mean, you guys threw out some stats beforehand, of just the caliber of wrestlers there. I think 79 state qualifiers, 14 medalists, 2 state champs, a state finalist. I mean, that's about as loaded as it gets. And the action was pretty good up there at the Morristown Armory. So what were some of the things that really stood out from a weekend, like you said, that was really packed with some of the best wrestlers in the state? Man, that's as close to a state tournament level tournament you're going to get in December.
Yeah, I mean, so listen, a couple of those champs who were preceded and originally in the field scratched, Sonny Amato being the big one. And we wound up with a dozen state medalists instead of, I think, the original number of 14 or whatever it might have been, but still a fantastic field that Dumont head coach and longtime tournament director Chris Potetto has put together. And he's made it a point to only bolster the field year after year. I mean, he always consistently invites Green Farms, which is a national power from Connecticut, Ponagansett, power from Rhode Island, Mount St. Charles, which is also in Rhode Island, had a kid in the final. And, talking to coaches of all different stripes, whether it was Sean Smythe at Mount Olive, Anthony Verdi at St. Peter's Prep, the one refrain that we always heard and that they always came back to was, they respect this tournament so much for the level of competition and the caliber of guys that they know that their teams are going to see. And I think, that was evident early on. I mean, for Del Barton to, value this tournament so highly that it enters Cam Sons, who's a 2-time state champ, again, for there to be all these state medalists in this field, I think that just goes to show what this tournament means to people and, how much it means to them to really compete and wrestle at this tournament. And yeah, I mean, listen, there was some great wrestling. Green Farms won the team race, but, Ryan did a story, Paramus Catholic had maybe the best showing of any team in the tournament, both on the boys' side and the girls' side. They were the top finishing team from New Jersey. So yeah, I mean, Ryan, I know you talked to Coach John Piella yesterday about kind of their efforts there. What kind of stood out to you from what he said?
Yeah, he's really preached culture with this team. Obviously, very good coach, very good staff there that they have. But, he mentioned culture and just how a lot of these kids are seniors now. I mentioned on the first episode the 4 blood rounders they had last year, Nicky Polito and Nick Barone being 2 of them, and they won championships on Sunday at the Armory at 144 and 150 respectively. And, the Paladins got 4 more to the podium. Grayson Abrazizi, Harry Asatrian, Joey Polici, and Guy Olsner. Polici and Olsner both reached the final. Polici ran into the buzzsaw that is Cam Sons, and Guy Olsner got pinned by Nevin Matisich. Matisich was MOW, had a fantastic tournament. I don't think he even got scored on. And this is a team, like I mentioned, they're just a very motivated team. And this was all without Seach Hibbler, who didn't make weight. He's coming down to 138. It's a tough cut for him, but doable. I think he's at about 140 now, so he's very, very close. Not quite. I think that's, obviously we're a long way from AC, but, a state finalist in Seach Hibbler changing weight classes. I mean, that's something that everyone's going to have their eyes on. But this Paramus Catholic team, I think they're a bit slept on, right? In the sense that they're yes, they're in our top 10 of our top 20, but they're not a team that's going to win non-public A, but they can cause a lot of fits, right? They have a lot of, like you saw over the weekend, they could have a great team showing at an individual tournament. And even in duels, they could give, teams a lot of problems. The quad that they'll be at this weekend at Pope John should be pretty fun. And then I saw a team in Lower Cape May. They have a couple freshmen. One was out in Ryan Morgan, but Eli Glover had a very impressive tournament. And obviously, two champs in Tristan Rosemeyer and Chase Hansen. I got to see Chase Hansen up close for the first time. And I mean, he is absolutely fantastic. You could see why he won multiple state medals. Bill, what's, I guess, your takeaway from Lower Cape May to start the year? You told me when I was messaging you during the first day of the tournament, they're in our top 20 for a reason. And that's a team that you could see they're going to contend for Group 2. I mean, obviously Rumson's the team to beat there, but I think that they've put a team together where they're going to compete.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, we put them in the top 20 for a reason. They were a team that won South Jersey 2 years ago for the first time in 40 years, lost in an epic match against Middle Township last year. But they bring back pretty much everybody from last year's team, at least the big guns. I mean, you have Chase Hansen at 138, depending on, again, guys are still settling in the weight classes, but could potentially be the guy to beat there in the state. Rosemeyer was a transfer from Williamstown. He was a blood rounder a year ago. You mentioned the two freshmen. And they just have a bunch of other guys that are really solid. This is a team that I expect will win South Jersey Group 2. Depending on how the PowerPoints and whatever break down, could find themselves at Rutgers on February 22nd. But they look as good as we thought they were going to. Hansen is a rider commit. He's never lost a match before the state tournament, and they've decided to go out this year and give him and the rest of this team, some more challenges. They've never been in the Cali before, and obviously they had two champs, Hansen being one of them. They will be able to escape the rock next month, so that they'll get tested more there. So we'll see more and more of what this team is, but I fully expect them again to be maybe one of the best teams in Group 2, potentially even give St. Augustine a run in the Cape Atlantic League. St. Augustine's only lost one match in the league since 2012. That match isn't until February, but they look really strong.
And a new tournament that Jake, you were at, Northumberland head coach Dave Bell is trying to put together what he hopes to be one of the premier dual meet tournaments, not just in New Jersey and in the area, but in the nation. And that's the Fab 50 duel. So Jake, what were some of your takeaways of that initial event that really had some big time programs present?
Yeah, so it's actually the third year of the event, is my understanding. But last 2 years it was out in Oklahoma at Oklahoma State, and the National Wrestling Hall of Fame. They came east this year for a variety of reasons, and when Dave Bell was given the chance to host it through some I guess fortune landing their way, he jumped at the opportunity. And so yeah, in that field you had from New Jersey, you had Blair's B team, North Hunterdon, St. Joe's Montvale, and Dilbarton, all of whom sent their full complement of guys, except for Blair, obviously, with their B team, as well as you had Green Farms Academy in that, Ponagansett, Wyoming Seminary, and one other team. And for me, the thing that really stood out is just how eager these teams were to all wrestle each other. And, nobody was shying away from competition. Nobody was, trying to maneuver their lineup and bump guys up, bump guys away from each other. No, these teams sought out the best and, made it a point to show that their guys were going to be tested and that they weren't shying away from competition. I mean, Dilbarton won the team tournament, and they dominated. They were undefeated on the day. They weren't even particularly tested. The only team they didn't wrestle there was Wyoming Seminary, because they have a duel with them later in the year, which will certainly be one to watch. But yeah, like, North Hunterdon, they acclimated themselves well. Yeah, they lost to some of these teams. I don't know that anybody expected them to, beat a team like Sam or Green Farms, but, they beat Pontiac, who was nationally ranked coming in. So that's a nice win. Joe's and Delbarton didn't wrestle because, they'll see each other at the Catholic duels. But yeah, I mean, Dave Bell has kind of routinely said, like, he wants North Hunterdon to be on the level of, Poway out in California or a lot of these other big time public schools that are national brands. And he said this is kind of the way to do that. And, I think an event like this with, teams who are super eager and willing to test themselves and kind of put their money where their mouth is and show, hey, that they're not just state powers, but that they're nationally ranked for a reason, I think is only ever a good thing for the sport. And, again, I think, like St. Joe's had a great match with Wyoming Seminary that came down to the last bout. I think it was the penultimate bout or bout before. Ben Marks, who transferred into St. Joe's from West Essex, was down 14-2, got quick reversal, lift, and he picked up a pin down 14-2 to put St. Joe's on top with like about to go. So, there were a lot of great moments. Tommy Marchetti from Delbarton in the Greens Farms match was in, a thrilling, 22-19, I think was the final bout there in one of the swing bouts. So, I think there was a lot to be impressed by. And I think, again, it's good that, these teams are going out of their way to test themselves and to not just, stay within the confines of the Garden State. And, I'm sure, knowing North Hunterdon and all these other teams, that they're going to continue to do that. So, yeah, I think this was a kind of a great first taste.
Several exits down the parkway was the Mustang Classic, which we believe, Joe, I talked to legendary Brick Memorial head coach Tony Caravella, who was in attendance, and he said he believes it's the 30th year. If anyone know, it'd be him because he started the tournament, but pretty sure it was the 30th Mustang Classic, again at Brick Memorial. Usually a really good field. We had some teams drop out this year that have traditionally been in it, but still some quality wrestling. A dominant performance by Camden Catholic, who we will get to. But Joe, I mean, your focus there coming out was, a two-time state medalist from Ocean County, winning another title, and just kind of some questions there about what weight we think he's going to go for the state tournament. Let's touch on that. Big performance from Point Pleasant Borough's Jake Clayton.
Yeah, Jake has been to Atlantic City twice. He was 7th as a freshman and 4th last year. First of all, he's bigger than I've ever seen him coming off football season. If people don't know, he is Point Borough's tremendous option quarterback, and he looks big. And he told me beforehand he won Bob, he won his 3rd Mustang title at 65. So he, like a lot of other 165 pounders around the state, are watching what Jaden James does. Now, I think we all presume he's going to go 165, and that's going to leave kids like Jake Clayton, who is a quality wrestler, to make a decision. Do you want to stay there and, go head up with him? I mean, he's a presumptive favorite no matter where he goes, at least Jade James is. But, Jake said he's going to see how he feels in a few weeks and decide where to go. I always wonder about those decisions because I don't necessarily think finishing 2nd in the state to Jaden James is terrible. And as Point Borough coach Pat Brady said to me yesterday, there's not a bad weight class in New Jersey, but it's interesting that wherever Jaden James decides to go, it's going to impact at least 2 weight classes, both below 165 and above 165 for guys who are fleeing him. Clayton is not in his best football shape, but he won handily across the board. And, I think he's going to be a podium kid no matter where he goes. He said he was between 175 and 180 after football. And, going down to 57 is a pretty big cut. I mean, especially after wrestling 65 last year, Bob.
Yeah, I think that is a good point you make about the weight, certainly with Jaden James. Like, where are you going to go? Do you want to take the route where the weight class is going to clear out and maybe I have an easier path to get to the final. But then when I get to the final, I might have to bring a medieval weapon with me to have a chance? Or do you, go a different weight class, which theoretically, you have a better chance of winning the state title, but the road to get there will be a lot tougher. And also, what weight does is your body going to operate best at? I think those are all valid questions. And, like Jake and Point Borough head coach Pat Brady said, like, we're going to see how it plays out. I know Jake said, to you that he usually doesn't get in his best wrestling shape until the postseason starts. So I think we're going to see with him and a lot of other people, how that falls. And that's definitely going to be some interesting things to watch going forward with the weights, as it usually is when you have, a wrestler like Jaden James there, he's the moon, the tides rise and fall based on his actions. Also at the Mustang Classic, they didn't keep team scores officially. If they did, Camden Catholic would have won by 122 points. It was that kind of day for the Irish, the defending non-public B champions, one of the storied programs in New Jersey high school wrestling history. They look really good, Bill, and look like they could have one of the better teams they've had in a while. 6 champions, 4 other runners-up. They had 2 wrestlers also finish in the top 5, and it was an impressive performance by them. I talked to head coach Bill Heverly afterwards, and he knew what the Hammers were going to do, but he was impressed with some of the other wrestlers coming through with titles, and he also felt like some guys that were close, they're not too far away from making a big jump too. So an impressive showing for the Irish down at Brick Memorial, Bill.
Yeah, they did not have a good Beast of the East. They only had one place winner, which was freshman Stephen Magocius, the 106-pounder, who had a really good tournament there, beat Pulse Pro's Will Cruz, who was a blood rounder last year in the blood round of the Beast. Sammy Spalding did not wrestle there. He was a little banged up. He actually made his season debut at the Mustang at 138 pounds, which I'll be interested to see where he ends up this year, if he ends up going back down to 132, which is where he won the state title a year ago, but looked really good. Obviously, the other day at the Mustang at 138. And then Cage Jones, who was their state finalist, lost in the 3rd round of the Beast, and then ended up medically forfeiting out. Did not look like himself in that match. And then some of their other state place winners did not place. But this looked like the team that I think at the Mustang that the Camden Catholic thought it had and probably will have this year. This is a team that was undefeated last year for the first time in 5 decades, won the non-public B title. Had, I believe, 4 state place winners, including Spalding, who won the state title. All those state place winners are back. Eric Swanson, who's in that mix in the middle with Spalding and Cage Jones, and Michael Kraft is a multiple-time state qualifier. They got the 2 freshmen down low. Bagocius looks like a kid that could be on the podium. Chris Amato, 113. But what really, to me, is standing out is what they're doing in the upper weights. Jaden Simpson is another one. Was 4th in the state last year. Had been like a middleweight, upper middleweight the last few years. Is now at 190. So he strengthens those upper weights where they usually didn't, have somebody that was of that caliber. 215, Madam Rosario has been coming along. He was kind of in and out of the lineup last year. But this year, had a nice performance at the Beast, even though he didn't place, won the Mustang. And then a heavyweight, you have Lars Stegner, who is now in his 3rd year as a starter. So he has gotten better and better. Maybe he doesn't profile as a state qualifier, state place winner necessarily, although he could potentially get the AC. But he's solid in that spot. So you go through those lineups, you have studs, you have a half a dozen studs, you have some freshmen, that are coming in and adding to what they had. And now you have upper weights that have kind of closed some of those holes that we saw the last few years. And it's really a team that's just built, 1 through 14, to accomplish every goal that they have for themselves this year, and potentially be better than the team last year that was undefeated.
And another South Jersey wrestler, Bill, that had a really nice performance was Ryan McConaughey of West Deptford. Took on Colts Next Ethan Michaels in the 126-pound final. And, Michaels had been on fire to start the season. He picked up his 100th career win earlier at the Mustang Classic, was 8th at the Beast of the East. And that was a hard-fought back and forth championship bout. Went to overtime, and it was McConaughey coming up with the winning takedown to win 8-5. That's a nice early season win, certainly to get a title, but considering the opponent, how well Michaels had been wrestling, that seems like an early season win that really will do well for McConaughey.
Yeah, he was WrestleBack 3 last year, had a very good season, was at a tough weight class in his district and region and came through. Started this year, I don't want to say a little slow, but his first match of the year, lost to Grayson Pettit from Delsey. Who he went up a weight to face Pettit and lost a tough match there. But that Pettit's a very solid wrestler, former state qualifier who hurt his knee at the end of last year and wasn't able to compete in the postseason. So wasn't a terrible loss, but I'm sure not the way he wanted to start the season. But I think that that win in the Mustang shows that he's a guy that West Deptford can count on. They're definitely their best wrestler, and is somebody that can conceivably challenge to get on the podium this year at States.
Team-wise, again, team scores were not kept, but two teams that had strong showings were Jackson Township, Middletown North. Right behind Camden Catholic, well, not right behind, but behind Camden Catholic's 6 champions, Middletown North 3 champions, brothers Thomas and Ryan Blewett, one at 106 and 113 respectively, and then Daniel Benbrook, the senior, up at 175. We'll touch on them team-wise more in an upcoming segment, but Joe, individually, Thomas Blewett was WrestleBack 4 last year at 106 pounds. He's a junior. He's still at 106. He's a big 6-pounder. He's got a lot of length. He's pretty tall. He's hard to deal with. He had an impressive tournament just in terms of, just getting it done, winning the title. Joe, is he someone that you think down the line is someone we're going to have to look at as a title contender at 106, just given the fact that, he's been there. He's an older wrestler for 106, and he's got those physical traits that make him pretty tough to deal with at that lower weight class.
As far as a title contender, I don't know at this point, but I will say I would unquestionably say he's a podium contender. I mean, Bill touched on Camden Catholic Stephen Bogosius a few moments ago. That's who Thomas Blewett defeated in the Mustang final, 5-3. What really impressed me there was his toughness. And, Bogosius kept coming and coming and coming. And you talked about the length that Blewett has. Every time it seemed like Bogosius was in pretty deep on a single or a double, Blewett would drape that long leg over his hip and pull himself up, pull himself out of trouble. His brother was terrific. He's only a freshman. Again, he's got a similar body type to his brother, to Thomas. Ryan Blewett is long, and he was really in it was almost a nasty match against Camden Catholic's Christian Amato. But the kid never lost his poise, never got flustered, and he went on and he won the match impressively. He had 3 takedowns and he won 8-0 over another quality wrestler. And then, of course, you go up a little higher with the Benbrook kid, another proven performer for the Lions. And then also, Middletown North had 2 kids third. Nicholas Wall was third at 150, and Nico Cordova was third at 165. Now, you and I both think Howell is the favorite in the division, but Middletown North opened my eyes a little bit, and maybe they can make a run at Howell. Howell may have a little too much bonus power, especially up top, but I think Middletown North established themselves as a sectional contender. Bob, how do you feel about it?
Yeah, I think so. Look, they were right on the cusp last season, lost to North Hunterdon in the sectional final. Frankly, in a match they probably should have won. And then North Hunterdon went on to win the overall Group 4 title. So Middletown North is right there. They have been for several years. For a while, they kept running to Phillipsburg and losing, by a bout. And the same thing happened last year on a walk-off to North Hunterdon. They're right there. And like I said, they have a deep lineup. They're gearing themselves towards, winning the team championship. It's just going to be a matter of just getting it done. I mean, they're going to be there. So can they win it? We'll see. So moving on now, after we recap, some of the top things from last week, we know the top teams in the state. What teams have opened our eyes that we didn't originally think would be some of the top teams in the state? I think that's a pretty good list now as we're a couple weeks in. And Ryan, I'll throw it to you. A couple Bergen County teams. One you mentioned already has had some really strong showings in tournaments and opened some eyes, and that's the Paladins of Paramus Catholic.
Yeah, mention them and the job they did at the Cali. And before I, get into a little more about them and Pascack Valley, I just want to say I was also very impressed, giving the Shore some more love. Ricky DiLorenzo from Toms River East. I know that's a team that you guys have your eyes on. He was fantastic in his rematch with Dalton Weber. Weber beat him 6-3. Weber kind of got to his legs a little bit in that first match at the Beast of the East. And, DiLorenzo kind of had all the answers for him in the second match. On top, he got a turn and then didn't really let Weber get to his offense in that third period. So DiLorenzo, to me, he medaled last year. I believe he was fourth in the state. Mm-hmm. He has all the makeup of a kid who I think can win a state championship. We'll see what weight he ends up at. I know a lot of those lower weights are pretty tough, but I came away very impressed with him. And I'll say this about Pascack Valley. Obviously, I mentioned Paramus Catholic, with the Cali. Pascack Valley, and bias aside, I am an alum. Jake is also an alum. This is a very good team. This is a very good Panthers team. They added Jacob and Sarah, who transferred in from Don Bosco. Aiden Cedeno was a state qualifier last year. And then, the likes of a lot of kids who won, high 20s matches, low 30s matches last year. Dylan Beagle, Delvin Oxman, Alex Bainbridge, Jason Fouché, and then Luke Stemkowski, had a big win over Joey Ruiz at the Cali. I don't think Ruiz is quite 100% yet. He's a state medalist from St. Peter's Prep. I don't want to take anything away from Stemkowski, but Stemkowski did beat Charlie Shadow last year, from Ridgewood. He was a state qualifier, and he's kind of shown hey, I can blow up a bracket here. I'm here. And that's exactly what Stemkowski is. And this is a really good team overall. I mentioned all the kids, a lot who have won 30 matches, can win 30 matches again this year and, take runs deep into regions and state wrestlebacks. But we'll be mentioning a lot of teams over the course of the season. And I think one that's going to consistently come up in the Group 2 ranks is Pascack Valley.
And out in the western portion of the state a little bit, a couple teams from Somerset County, a team from Hunterdon County, and a team from Union County caught your eyes, Jake, early this season.
Yeah, so, there are a couple of different teams, not all of them are necessarily state contenders, but just teams that have caught my eye, certainly, to start the year. Probably the biggest one so far would be Bridgewater. The Panthers had a banner year. Last year, they won their most dual meets ever, going 21-8. They made their first state final ever when they beat Monroe in the Group 5 semis on the final bout on a pin by Matt McCann, who was also one of the only wrestlers at the Sam Cali this weekend to knock off a top seed. And, the Panthers have, haven't missed a beat. They're 4-0 to start the year. They wrestled Monroe again back on December 20th. They won that bout, they won that duel, 40-34. Again, on something that was decided by the last bout. It was 34-34 with one to go. Andrew Adele gets a pin to seal it for Bridgewater. They beat a very good Hopewell Valley team. And, they're a team that's in that top division of the Skyland Conference with Immaculata, with North Hunterdon, with Peaburg, with Watchung Hills. And for a long time, they haven't necessarily been able to kind of get over that hump and be one of those elite Skyland Conference teams and, be in that conversation with a team like North or Peaburg. But, they have a lot of good individual pieces. And if they keep wrestling the way they have, especially with, Phillipsburg potentially having some holes, with North Hunterdon having some questions up top, like we saw against Southern, I think there's an avenue there for Coach Kyle Murphy's group to really go on a deep run and make some noise again. And then, a team kind of in a lower division, or two teams kind of in lower division. So Del Val's in the second division in the Skyland, but as anybody who follows the sport knows, Andy Fitz has that team punching way above its weight consistently. They're the defending Group 1 champs for a reason. They're off to a 5-0 start. They beat Pompton Lakes, who's always solid. They beat High Point, who's fresh off a section title last year. Governor Livingston, who made a section final. And they're wrestling Morris Knowles, Bloomfield, Hunterdon Central, Peaburg, all Group 4, Group 5 schools. So, they're another team that I think is one to keep an eye on, along with Ridge, who's in that division. They're 6-1. Their only losses to West Essex this year. And, I think, Ridge, finished 10th at the Cali as a team, despite only having 4 wrestlers who placed. So, Roy Dragon has really turned that program around. And, I think, obviously they didn't repeat as Group 4 champs last year. But, I think they're well on their way. And then a team that is sort of in a lower division in the Skyland, but that's impressed me is Franklin. They have a new coach this year, Anthony Messner. He's a Franklin alum. He's the first Franklin wrestler to ever compete in a state final. He's third all time in wins there as a wrestler. And he has them off to a 4-1 start, which is one of their best starts in years. And, I think they're a team that, in that kind of lowest division in the Skyland could really make some noise, spring some upsets, and put some impressive results together. And I touched on them briefly when I mentioned Ridge, but it just one other team that I wanted to give a shout out to is West Essex. They're 5-0 to start the year, and 5, I would argue, pretty impressive wins. They beat Livingston and Bloomfield in the Super Essex Conference, and then they actually beat High Point on Criteria E, which is most 6-point results, because I think they each had 2 pins, but West Essex received a forfeit, which I think decided the match as the decisive 6-point result. And so that's a great win. Obviously, High Point's one of the historic programs. They beat a Long Branch team that won a section title by 21 points. And they beat Ridge by 18 points. So I think Mike Markey's group, again, is one. And, we talked about Reed Clausey on the last episode, but it's not just him. I think you're starting to see some of the other guys on this team kind of really round into form and show you, what they're capable of. And then in Union County, like Bob said, for a long time, Cranford's been the standard bearer in Union County, and for good reason. Obviously they don't have Jordan Chapman this year, but they have another state medalist back in Mike Daly at 120. And, they have Luke Schultz and Ryder Connors and a bunch of other hammers. But the team that's most impressed me so far is Union. They're 6-0. They got called up to the top division in the UCC after going 7-0 in the Mountain Division last year. They're in the Watchung this year. They're off to a 6-0 start as a team, the Farmers are, which is one of their best starts, again, in years. And Coach Dino DiBolonia has done a great job there. They went from, a decade-long streak of not having state qualifiers to I think they've had 3 in the last 3 years. They had a representative at the Cali, and, they already have impressive wins over Rahway and Scotch Plains and some other teams. They'll be tested, going forward with Cranford, Westfield, some other teams, Ridge. But, I think a team like that's off to a 6-0 start, it's hard not to, keep an eye on them. And I know they're not the only ones. I'm sure, Bob and Joe or Bill, you guys have teams that you're, keeping an eye on also.
Down in the Shore Conference, a couple of Group 4 teams that, we think can make some noise later on in the postseason. We talked about Middletown North just previously, but we'll go back to the Lions again. This is a program that has really consistently been a contender within the Shore Conference, with whatever division they're in. You go back some years, they've had a huge win, over CBA. This is before Billy Ashnault was there, but when CBA was one of the top teams in the Shore, they beat Howell in a huge match that ended, I believe, Howell's really long Class A North winning streak when that was the division alignment. They've been to a bunch of sectional finals, and they have a clear identity. You go back to when Matt Sergio was leading the program, and now Eric Morley, who was an assistant under Sergio, now is the head coach. they come with a specific style. You know what you're going to get from them, and I mean that in a positive way. And they're in the mix. I like their lineup. They're balanced from top to bottom. They're pinners too. They will take advantage and get 6 points when those opportunities present themselves. And I'm really interested to see if they can finish it off. Certainly North Hundred and Mount Olive you have there as the teams I think you would put on paper as the favorites in Group 4. Middleton North is going to have to prove they can get past those teams, but I think the Lions, Joe, have proven that they're going to be in that discussion. It's just a matter of can they finish it off, on championship day. But I think that they are squarely in that conversation with some of the, the hammers they have as individuals, but just the depth of that lineup. A lot of quality kids, 1 through 14, that make them a really, really good dual meet team.
Well, you could see that at the Mustang the other day. They had multiple kids finish in the top 6 there. And as you said, one of the reasons you go to a tournament like the Mustang, and granted, that's not the high level like the Cali or the big Beast of the East, but the Memorial Tournament is one you can measure yourself and see, what you have or what you don't. And I think, Coach Morley saw he has kids who will compete and battle and not give up points. So, yeah, I do agree with you. And, another team I came away impressed with, and we touched on them last week, Bob, was Jackson Township. Now, they finished second in the unofficial point standing at the Mustang, but the photo you see there, Armani McCann, a state placer last year, did not wrestle. He wrestled 8 or 9 bouts at the Beast, and Gianni Gione, head coach, opted to hold him out. So what they did at Brick Memorial was without their best wrestler. They managed to get, Tucker Pazinko, who's in at 44. He was second. His brother Finley at 157 was second. Akbar Nurzinadov at 175. And a kid that I didn't see when they opened the season at Tom's Over East, Logan Schlenk, was there at 215. I mean, they got a third from their heavyweight, a fourth from a 150 pounder, and 2 fifths. And, Gianni Gione's going to bring them along slowly. And I think when they get into the dual meet season, they're in the same division with Howell and Ocean and Middletown North. And I think they're going to be right there. And again, Gianni Gione thinks that in Central 5, especially with 100 in Central in a serious rebuild, that they might be able to make a run at that title.
Yeah, and especially with Howell and Southern both aligned in South Group 5. And I misspoke earlier. I said 2 Group 4 teams. Still getting back to the Jackson 1 school, Group 5 now. But you're right, Joe. The fact that they're in Central 5, that door seems like it could be open. And, tournaments, dual meets, like they're not the same thing, but Jackson looks like a strong dual meet team when they have their full lineup. You mentioned the guys up top, Akbar Nazardinov. And then at 215, Logan Schlenk, a kid I hadn't really seen at all. I mean, he's a big kid at 215, and that was a pretty good final against Madden Rosario there. And that's the kind of kid in a dual meet that can pick you up some big wins and even some bonus points. So I think Jackson is definitely a team to watch going forward. Are they on the level of Southern and Howell? No, but they look like they can be in a position to win a sectional title. If you could do that and add another, championship banner, that definitely will be, considered a successful season. Moving on to South Jersey, Bill, I know you have a couple teams. Kingsway was a team in the preseason you were pretty high on. I know they're not quite back to their, championship nature, but it seems like they're on their way. And then Shawnee too, as wrestled well early in the season and kind of opened some eyes.
Yeah, Kingsway had made it to 7 straight sectional finals before last year, was also ranked in the top year-end top 20 all of those years. Took a step back last year, was under 500, although against their typically challenging schedule. Did make it to the semifinals of the groups before they lost to Southern. This year they've added a couple impressive freshmen, Evan Vallejo, Matthew Miranda, Joel Alfonso, Griff Preziosi. 3 of them won titles at the season opening Vojadine tournament. They had a really nice opening dual meet win against Clearview, who's a team that I think has a lot of potential this year, and was also very young with some freshmen that are going to impress. I think they're on their way back for sure. We'll see what that means in terms of postseason. I think some of these freshmen are definitely going to make some runs, qualify for states, and they've got more on the way. They also added a couple transfers from Camden Catholic, Chris and Tristan Owen, who are brothers. Chris has already made an impact in the upper weights. Tristan is sitting out his transfer because he's a senior, but they should have him back for the heavy part of their schedule, the Jack Welch duels, Washington Township, some of those duels and tournaments in mid and to late January. So I think they have a chance to kind of contend with Washington Township, and for sure in South Jersey, we obviously Hal is very strong. So whether they get back to a sectional title or not this year, I'm not sure, but they're definitely a team where the arrow is pointed up. And Shawnee has impressed me in the early going. It's kind of hard to tell. They only 3 matches so far, but they're 3-0. They beat West Deptford, which was a little bit of an upset, I think. It looks like they have Jordan Siegel back. He was 4th in the state as a sophomore. Did not wrestle much last year. Was injured at the Beast. Came back, wrestled the districts, won, but then pulled out of the rest of the postseason. He went 2-2 with the Beast with a win over the number 12 seed there. So if he's healthy, and they can add some pieces around him, South Jersey Group 4 has kind of been the wide open section in the South, really. Some of the other ones, Paulsboro in Group 1 and Delsey in Group 3 and Southern in Group 5. You see the same favorites year after year, but Group 4 is kind of Shawnee won it a couple years. Then Northern Burlington won it 2 years ago. Last year was the Toms River teams, East and South, made it to the final. We'll find out more about Shawnee over the next few weeks. They wrestle Seneca, Rancocas Valley, Camden Catholic, but they look like a team that in that group that is very often wide open. They could definitely make a run in Group 4 and is maybe back to the level of where they were a couple of years ago when they were one of the teams to beat in South 4.
And real quick before we move on to our next segment, just want to go back to the Mustang Classic Joe and I were at on Sunday. A really nice moment where, as I mentioned, former Brick Memorial, legendary coach Tony Caravella, his nephew Stephen Janos is the head coach. He was back, and they honored longtime, legendary Hall of Fame assistant coach Dennis DeAndre, who passed away, last in the spring. And they honored him by, renaming the tournament after them. Had a nice presentation. That was nice to see, Joe, because, you and I knew Dennis very well. And he meant a lot to wrestling, not just at Brick Memorial, but in the Shore Conference. So a very well-deserved honor. It was nice to see his family in attendance as well.
Not only in the Shore Conference, around the state, Denny is was one of the most beloved guys around. He just absolutely lived for wrestling, and it didn't matter whether you were a Brick Memorial kid or a Jackson kid or, a North Warren kid. He was going to do what was best for the sport, and he died, last November. And it was really nice. His wife Eileen and daughter Kelsey were there, and it's now going to be called the Dennis DeAndrea Mustang Classic. And Denny was one of the founding fathers of the event, and it's special and nice that Steve Giannos wanted to put his own mark on the Brick Memorial program. And in case you don't know, he is Tony Caravella's nephew. And the first thing he did was, reach back into history and name this tournament after Dr. D. And I thought it was marvelous, Bob.
Definitely great to see. Moving on, injuries are always a big part of the sport. It seems like early in the season, there's guys out of lineup. We're kind of waiting for them to make their debut. There seems to always be some early season injuries that we're dealing with now. So let's touch on some of those. We'll jump up to Bergen County first. Ryan, some guys that have been out, but certainly look like they're going to be back in the lineup sooner than later.
Yeah, one of them we haven't seen yet. I mentioned him earlier in the episode, Dante DeLuca. He's just unwinding from football season. He's got a couple of bruises, stuff like that. That's what Coach Almeida told me. I'm expecting him to be fine. He'll be on the mat soon. The other one, I mentioned this one on the first episode, Joey Canova. We're still waiting for him to be cleared. He tore his ACL late last year. He's probably going to be on the mat sometime this month. Next month, I should say, because we're still in December. The one I didn't mention on the previous episode, Nate Braun is out for the season. I don't know why I didn't mention that, but he's out for the season due to an injury I've been told not to disclose, and that sucks because he's a three-time medalist, two-time state finalist. I think he very much had a case to make a deep run this year. Ryan DeGeorge is questionable for the Catholic duels, according to Coach Brian Stoll. If he doesn't wrestle then, he'll probably wrestle not long after. John McGinty isn't in the field at Powerade this week, but he's expected to be fine for the Catholic duels. That's according to Coach Tom Farinero. I mentioned Cole Rebels on the last episode. We'll see. His season debut is still to be determined, but nothing that extreme up north aside from the unfortunate Braun news. You had, last year, DeJesus was out, Belante was out, Jimmy Sloan, Gabe Logan. It was North Jersey kind of got gutted last year, but aside from the Braun stuff, it's kind of been a little quiet up here, Bob.
In the Shore Conference, a couple of injuries of note, both for Christian brothers. Joe had mentioned on last week's episode, Brock Ozerwitz, their junior, 175/190 pounder, third in the state last season. He was out, had a surgical procedure done, but I know the Colts expect him back sometime in January. The other big one that we don't know much about is sophomore Sean Kenny, the IO commit, third in the state last season at 106 pounds. He has not wrestled so far this year, and there's question marks whether he will be back at all. We'll find out some more when we see head coach Billy Ashnault in person at the Catholic school duels coming up later this week. The silver lining for the Colts is they do have Sonny DiMatteo, the transfer from Brick Morrill, who was fourth in the state last season at 106, lost to Kenny in that third place bout. So he slides in there. He's wrestling at 120. So the depth of CBA, helps them fill that hole. But if Kenny isn't able to go, that is a huge loss for them, and it kind of takes away any flexibility they would have down low. Personally, you hope those guys get healthy and can go back on the map because, listen, you only get 4 years of high school. You miss significant time like that. That's definitely a bummer. I don't think there's anything else you're really significant injury-wise in the Shore. I know there's guys banged up. Joe, anything else, or is it just those two guys?
Those are the two biggest names for sure at this point, Bob.
And then down in South Jersey, Amari Van of Delsey, he was banged up, going back to the Robin Left tournament down at Southern. I saw that firsthand. He was wrestling Amari McCann from Jackson. Came up, it looked like a scary knee injury. Had the injury to fault that match. He came back later in the tournament and finished up. But it looks like there's still some nagging things with him, Bill. So any insight on Amari Van and some of the other injuries down in South Jersey?
Yeah, he, at the end of the, he was obviously a region champ as a freshman and really almost beat Paul Kenny in the state tournament, lost by a point. Had very high goals last year, and then kind of developed a little bit of a condition where he was dealing with some dizziness. Really kind of came up and hit him at the region tournament. He had to withdraw. But he's cleared that. He hasn't had any more issues. As you mentioned, he got hurt at the left, which was actually a hamstring. Looked like a knee. And then was healthy, and then went back into the Sam Cali and in his I think it was a quarterfinal match, won 15-13, but got banged up there and had to withdraw again. So hopefully he can kind of put together a healthy stretch here going into the the rest of the season, because he's a kid that can contend for a state title. There's no doubt. If he can stay healthy, he's just had kind of, a couple instances here over the last, year that just kind of taken him off the mat. Then, down in Paulsboro, they had, last year they had a tough season. At one point they were 7-7, and Kyer Harvey, who had been decided not to wrestle, decided to come back, and they went on an 8-match winning streak, which culminated in them winning another South Jersey title. And they were obviously hoping for him to be back fully this year, but he got injured in the last football game of the season. He's out for the year. Another one of their standouts, Sawyer Cabanas, is out indefinitely. He's been dealing with some injuries. Then they had some other kids that one kid that quit the team, and another that they were hoping to come out that didn't. So they're struggling a little bit at the moment. They did have 3 champs at the Vogene at the beginning of the year, one being Will Cruz, who was the blood rounder. Sosa is another one who's kind of really taken a step up this year in the middle weights. But they're missing some guys, and it could be a tough year for them. They've won every South Jersey Group 1 title but one since they started in 1980. But they just beat Sterling 40-36 the other day. Sterling, who lost to Haddon Township, who's not really considered a contender, got beat by around 40 points by Haddonfield. Paulsboro gave up 6 pins and forfeits in that match. So they're going to need to get some guys healthy or get some guys back, or start to see some improvement. They've kind of dealt with this the last few years with giving up bonus points. That was kind of what put them in a little bit of a hole last year. But they look like they're in another. It's going to be another struggle for them to defend their title in South Jersey, and that'll be worth watching over the next few weeks.
All right, it's time to look ahead now because we've got a bunch of big time events coming up this week. We're going to start off with the Catholic school duels. That's the big one. That'll be January 2nd, 3rd, Friday and Saturday at Christian Brothers Academy in the Lincroft section of Middletown. It's really become an awesome event, one of the big ones on the calendar. Ryan and I will be there both days, and we anticipate to see some really high-level wrestling between certainly, many of the best teams in the state and the top individuals. What do you think, Ryan? I mean, last year it was Del Barton just kind of rolling through everyone else. Is it going to be more of the same?
That's my prediction, but you mentioned it being such a great event. This is the 3rd year of it, and I circle this on my calendar every year. I look forward to it. Billy Ashnault and CBA do a great job putting this together. It's a bunch of guys really who just care about putting together outstanding wrestling, and I'm all on board with that. I know you are too. We have a 12-team field. They break it into the 4 pools of 3 teams. In Pool A, we have CBA, Seton Hall Prep, and Immaculata. In Pool B, we have Delby, RBC, and Holy Cross. In Pool C, it's St. Peter's, Bergen Catholic, and St. Thomas Aquinas. And then in Pool D, it's SJR, St. John Vianney, and St. Augustine. And everyone wrestles each other twice. And then on day 2, it gets broken into the gold, silver, and bronze pools. The gold pool is for the top 4 teams. Then the silver pool, you usually get the 1-1 teams. And then the bronze is for the team that usually goes 0-2. And if you look at our top 20, of Del Barton, St. Joe's, St. Peter's, and CBA, they're all in different pools, as we would hope and, as we would expect. But don't forget, Bergen wrestled St. Peter's really tough in the on day 1 last year. And I think, they're in the same pool this year. I think it's going to be another great duel. Last year it came down to a win to, I think it was at 106 from Robbie Rodriguez. And that's where we kind of got introduced to him, or maybe it was 113. But then you saw Anthony Borrometti seal the win for St. Peter's in the last bout. They're going to reseed for day 2, basically based on common sense, right? They, everyone knows the landscape. They're going to pretty much stack it up how it should be. If a kid is out or multiple kids are out for one team, they might not wrestle another team that's banged up. So let's say, St. Joe's or CBA is missing a bunch of kids. They're not going to be wrestling each other in the semifinals. One of them's going to wrestle Del Barton, the other one's going to wrestle St. Peter's, or whoever is healthy. The teams at full strength will be the teams that are in the finals, right? They're going to set up the best 2 teams to make the finals. And I think that this, like I said, I think Del Barton's a team to beat when you look at what they have. These matches are all going to be wrestled, though. They're going to have to beat 2 really good teams to win. So that number 1 ranking that they have right now in our top 20, that's going to have to be earned. I think it will be. And then we're going to see a combination of probably St. Peter's, St. Joe's, CBA, St. Peter's, CBA. We're going to see a really good 3rd place match, really good semifinals both ways. I think no one's going to be happier than Colleen McGuire, because assuming that these teams are healthy and at full strength, and a lot of them are besides a couple kids, we're going to see how non-public A is going to, be stacked up. I know, Bob, you're going to be on the call for the finals. You're going to be down there with me both days. What do you make of what's going to happen? Is this a big measuring stick moment for CBA? I mean, how do you evaluate this whole thing?
Absolutely. Definitely on CBA, it's a big measuring stick because as we've talked about, last week and written about as well, Christian Brothers has reached a point where the next step is to beat the North Jersey Powers and compete with them on a consistent basis. They haven't shown they can do that yet. Is this the time they do that? We know that lineup is really good. They have some holes up top. It looks like they're probably going to not have Brock Osweiz, so that's definitely a big hole, in the upper portion of the lineup where they're not as strong as they are, certainly down low and in the middle. So that's something to watch. And just the caliber of wrestling. You're going to have, potential state final previews on the team side and also potentially on the individual side. We could see some amazing matchups that are going to be big for criteria, going forward into, not just the state tournament, but some of the region and even district tournaments as well. So there's a lot on the line. There's bragging rights. It's a measuring stick. You win this as a team, it can mean nothing going forward in terms of what's going to happen in non-public A, but it's going to give you a good idea. And individual, like I said, getting some criteria and potentially upping your seed, that's big for wrestlers this time of year. So those are some things to watch. Really excited about being, over there at CBA. We're going to have wall-to-wall coverage. We'll have stories. We'll have post up. And as Ryan mentioned, we'll be broadcasting the championship match live on NJ.com. So it should be a great 2 days of wrestling. And certainly that Saturday, I think most eyes around the state will be fixed there to see what goes down between, many of the best teams in New Jersey. A lot of other stuff going on, this coming week. I'm not a big quad guy, but sometimes there's some pretty big ones that we got to pay attention to. A big one, Jake, at Mount Olive, will have Southern, West Essex, and High Point, always one of the top quads on the schedule. Southern, not a big quad team either, but the ones they enter are usually some pretty high octane ones, gives them a good measuring stick, gets them some really good bouts, and that's what we're going to see, up at Mount Olive this coming weekend.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, I think the thing for me that I'll be sort of most interested in watching is, kind of exactly who's going to wrestle who, when, is Mount Olive going to go first against West Essex or Southern? And does that change the calculus for any of these teams? I think the thing for me is, if we get Mount Olive Southern and, Bob and I were at Southern North Hunterdon one of the first weeks of the season, Southern's upper weights, where maybe there were a few question marks. They had a career JV wrestler in Johan Figueroa at heavyweight win the match for them against North Hunterdon. And, you look at Mount Olive, that is, I would argue, kind of what they've become known for is their upper weights. Mm-hmm. Nico Gonzalez, who took fourth in the state last year at 215, leads that group, but Jared Martini at heavyweights, another reliable point getter for them up there. So I think, down low, I think both teams have some injuries. With Southern, we haven't seen Anthony Mason yet. With Mount Olive, we haven't seen Cole Rebels and a few others yet. So I think there are spots where, if both teams can either get bonus and exploit, some holes or limit bonus, I think you've got a chance really to see some fireworks. And, I think, again, West Essex to me is a team that's wrestling really well. And, outside of Reed Clausey, do they have another true hammer of that caliber? I'm not sure. But, they have kids who I think are good enough to get the job done and good enough to beat and exceed expectations and keep things close and keep West Essex in that race. So while I think, the matchup of the day is going to be Southern Mount Olive, certainly I think West Essex and again, High Point, I think definitely have enough going on in their lineups to add some intrigue.
And with Southern in there, the Rams, their depth has always been a huge strength of the program, just really going back forever. We saw that last season when they won Group 5 going away and dominated most of their regular season matches without two state medalists in Hayden Hotstrasser and Bryce Manera. And they did it again against North Hunterdon without their two-time state medalist Anthony Mason and also Attila Vigilante, a really strong wrestler in the middle of their lineup. We don't know when those guys are going to come back. It doesn't look like it's anything long-term with them, but, I would be surprised if we saw them in that quad. But again, Southern has shown they can kind of weather that storm without those guys in the lineup. The Catholic school duels we mentioned is going to have a bunch of the best teams, non-public from around the state. One team that won't be there is Camden Catholic, but the Irish are going to have a pretty darn good quad of their own, Bill.
Yeah, this is almost like a mini Catholic duels. I guess it's the teams that are not the non-public teams that are not participating. But this is going to be Camden Catholic, Paramus Catholic, Don Bosco, and Pope John. this is Camden Catholic's only non-conference duels of the year. Their schedule is very individual tournament based. They were at the Robin Left, they were at the Mustang, the Beast of the East. They'll be at Escape the Rock. So they use a lot of their match counts during those individual tournaments. So they don't really wrestle, some of the either better teams in the state or better teams in South Jersey. Typically. So this is their big test for them. And, last year they were able to, I think it was a try last year. Bosco was not involved. But they got past both of those teams and end up going undefeated. I think this will be their biggest test. And could be with Pope John, another preview of the non-public B state finals, which it was a year ago. So that's, that'll be a really interesting quad, outside of the Catholic duels with the rest of the other big non-public teams going on. And then, there's a lot of big dual meet tournaments in South Jersey. This is kind of the weekend for them, for the majority of them. Williamstown has an 8-team field, as does Hamilton and Collingswood. Lower Cape May is probably the best team at Williamstown. Hamilton, they've had the same 8 teams for as long as I can remember, which is a long time because I can remember pretty far back. But looks like maybe Washington Township and RV in the finals there. And then Collingswood's Dan Trainer duels, very intriguing. Toms River East, Kingsway, maybe the best teams, but also you have Hopewell Valley, Collingswood, Woodstown, some other decent teams, Gloucester, that they could make a run there. So. And then lastly, there's also the first weekend of January to do every year is the Lenape Regional High School District Quad with Shawnee, Seneca, Lenape, and Cherokee. And again, that Seneca-Shawnee match should be very interesting. So we'll find out a lot about a number of teams this weekend who are probably going to get 3 good dual meets.
And lastly, a huge non-conference tilt we'll have up in Warren County, 2 state powers. That'll be Howell taking the drive up to face Phillipsburg in the annual pit match. So that one, go back to the old gym in the pit, one of the iconic wrestling venues around New Jersey. They still keep it open for a big match or two every year. And that should be a big one. Phillipsburg, currently, shut down with some skin issues, but we expect them to be ready for that. And as Joe and I have talked about, Howell, a team that has its eyes on dethroning Southern in Group 5. This should be a really fun matchup there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was talking to St. Benedict's coach Harry Turner at the Sam Cali yesterday. He was obviously a prolific Howell heavyweight, and he still said like his 4 favorite dual meets he's wrestled in were when Howell wrestled Peaburg. And I know they got away from it for a while, but again, I think we talk about what this sport needs. The sport needs more stuff like this, of more of these high-profile non-conference teams, making these long drives, and the fan base is coming out. And yeah, that venue, the pit at Phillipsburg, it might not get more iconic anywhere in New Jersey than that. And so for that to not just be against a gimme, but for Peaburg to really want to challenge itself in that match and say, hey, listen, we realize if we want to get back on top of Group 4, we're going to have to beat a big Group 5 team and a big state power like Howell. So I give Coach Tim Longacre at Phillipsburg a lot of credit for that.
And Joe, on Howell, this is a chance for the Rebels to really show that, yes, they are a true contender and can challenge Southern in Group 5 and really make some noise when the team portion of the state tournament comes around.
Before I go into that, Bob, the last time Howell wrestled at Phillipsburg was kind of an unforgettable night for me. But what happened was a slightly intoxicated Phillipsburg fan made a bolt from the bleachers onto the mat with a Phillipsburg police officer in hot pursuit. And he took the person down by the ankles, and the entire gym stood up and went, 2. So that was a classic. Yeah, I think it's a big test for Hal. We understand they have some high-quality freshmen, beside Luke Johnson and Tanner Hodgins. But this is a chance for John Gagliano to put some of his younger wrestlers into a hostile environment, and it doesn't get much more hostile than the pit in Phillipsburg. So I think it's a really good measuring stick, not only for Phillipsburg, but for how.
Agreed, Joe. A lot coming up this week. We've already had a lot of action, and it's only going to heat up from there as we really get into the teeth of the dual meet season, starting when the calendar flips. That's going to do it for us today. Really good chatting with you guys, as always, on Weighing In. So for Ryan Patti, Jake Aferiat, Bill Evans, and Joe Zedalis, I'm Bob Batters saying thanks for joining us on the Weighing In podcast, and we'll see you next time on NJ.com.